All right, we are in Unit 2, Lesson number 9, Mission in Strange and Dangerous Spaces. I will speak for myself, but I have really enjoyed being with you this past month, being in these conversations with you. If it is your first time watching a video and you're like, well, I didn't spend any time in conversation with this person, so what? I'm Megan Westra. I'm a author and high school teacher based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
And my name is Benjamin Bixler. I am a PhD student at Drew Theological School studying biblical studies, and also a high school English or high school Bible and English teacher at Eastern Mennonite School in Harrisonburg, Virginia.
So we've been with you for the last month, walking through different passages in Acts. And this is our last time with you, but it has been a delight, at least for me. I speak for myself. Yeah. And so today we are looking at Acts chapter 16. Again, working on lesson 9, mission in dangerous and strange and dangerous spaces. Mm-hmm. So this takes us to the story of Lydia. It takes us to a prayer circle. There's all kinds of things going. I feel like there's just a lot going on in this passage. Yeah. But the part that really always just stops me in my tracks in this particular passage as I was reading it is that. There's this deliverance that happens for this young girl who is enslaved, and it's all good until the people realize that their way of making money is gone. Everybody's cool with it until the people who were enslaving this girl realize that they no longer have a way of making money anymore because Paul and Silas have done this deliverance. That's the part that sticks out most to me in this passage. I feel like there's so much going on here that maybe we should just kind of roadmap before we get into things. So that's what jumped out to me. What jumped out to you? And then we can just kind of figure out where we want to go with things.
Yeah, I think it'll work well because I kind of did a little bit of how do we get to where we are now thing, which is how we open. So we open with Lydia, then we have the story of this enslaved girl, and then we end up with them in prison in the conversion of the jailer. But I was really struck by the movement that we have from the beginning of Acts till Acts chapter 16 here. And there's kind of a break after Acts 15 where we've been centered in Jerusalem, and now the last half of the book, we tend to go out away from Jerusalem and into all these far-flung parts. But we end up with this, as Paul gets to where he is here in the city of Philippi, he tries to go into all these different areas, and the Spirit kind of is just nope, this road's closed, nope, this and we're forcing you into this specific area. And ironically enough, it's this, it's mainland Europe, modern day Europe. It's the center of Greece, which if you know much about your Jewish history, the Greek Empire was a pretty horrific thing. Read the story of First Maccabees and the Apocrypha if you want to get a sense of how visceral the reaction of Jewish people would have been to the Greek Empire. And this is where Paul's taking his message. And not only that, we just come out of the Jerusalem Council where we've had this whole discussion about do men need to be circumcised to join the Jewish community? Well, our first convert in chapter 16 is a woman. So we're setting that question entirely aside. We've blown the barn doors off of this conversation about who is this message for? It's even for the people living in this place that these people that we used to hate. It's even for this woman who we normally wouldn't even had in our vision and understanding of what it meant when we were discussing whether these people can come in or not. It just seems to me that we've come 180 degrees from where we started with this movement of Jewish people in the beginning of Acts chapter 2. And this trajectory is just taking us to new and exciting and inclusive places. So that's one of the things that just really struck me is our setting is not in Jerusalem, but up here in mainland Europe, modern day Europe, in the country of Greece. And so everything just gets blown out of the water here. So that's what struck me.
I like how what you were just saying, it reminded me of our conversation when we were talking about the Ethiopian eunuch and Philip, and how the Lord's just kind of bloop, 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 and just plunking him down and taking him away. And and the same thing happens here where it's that road's closed, this is closed, you're going to end up here. And, even though we like you were saying, like have moved so far from the questions that they were asking in Acts chapter 2. It seems like God is still very on plot. Like God is like, nope, this is what I'm doing the whole time. And just blowing the doors off and just saying like, no, well, that's nice that you hammered out that question of how men get into this community, but guess what? Like, it makes me think of the scene where it's like, I am no man, right? It's just like, this is completely irrelevant. And so I think to kind of watch for that, even in our communities now, our congregations now, of like, when we think we have arrived, or we think we've figured it out, or we think like, okay, good, glad we've put that question to rest, we've made it, that like, okay, now the work begins. Like now we can actually, we've made it into the story. Like we understand enough about what God's doing that like, great, all right, now time to catch up. Because I think I, as a person, tend to really want to like camp out on those moments and feel like, okay, good, whew, like let's breathe. And it's like, if we look at the book of Acts anyway, as an example, it's kind of like, well, no, right when you feel like, okay, we've had this big council, we've decided we're here, that like that's the moment where it's like, now we can start.
And like, even like you mentioned that prayer circle that's happening, and so like when he shows up in Philippi, like he's not going to the temple like they were in Acts chapter 2, because there's no temple. He's going outside the city gates. He's finding these women who are meeting, like it's all women who are doing this prayer circle. And like, that's where he meets Lydia. Like, so there's everything wrapped up in this, that it's just not what we're used to, not what's familiar, but instead something new is happening again here. New place, new people, new sort of centers of where we even meet. So yeah, I just really like the way that this second half of Acts really kicks off by just throwing that all out and saying, we're doing something new now.
Yeah. I also really appreciate, kind of going back to the part of the passage that really stuck out to me. I appreciate that Paul's annoyed and that like God works through his annoyance. That I feel like so often, a lot of the ways that I learned to orient spiritually were predicated on smashing down my humanity, not being annoyed, not being angry, not arguing. And kind of throughout this unit, we have Peter arguing with God. We have Paul here who just gets so annoyed with this girl that he's like, I command you to like, he's not delivering her out of like some benevolence or like, oh, I feel like the Lord is inviting me to cast out this. No. He's just annoyed. He's just had enough. And so I feel like, and even some of the things you were talking about with this, like, thinking about what would it have been like for Jewish men in Paul and Silas's case to go into the Greek Empire, to go to Greece and take that message there, and to think about like some of the real human elements that are coming through in this story, even amid like these really supernatural things where you have, this girl being delivered, you have the stories in prison where I don't think this one they go to, like they're not getting broken out of jail in this one, or no, they are. This is one where everyone's chains fall off, but like you've got some really like supernatural, like fantastical things happening, and in the midst of that, Paul is annoyed. Like you get some of these like really human moments too, and that too is a place where God is moving and working.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think, we tend to focus, I mean, we've talked a lot about sort of this movement of the Holy Spirit, but at the same time, like, it seems as though once the Spirit guides Paul here, like Paul's sort of like doing this work to just sort of go meet people where they are, whether it's Lydia out here at this prayer circle or this enslaved girl as he's walking in the street. Now, we don't know whether or not she's converted, or we don't really get the end of her story. She's just sort of a way to sort of move Paul along through the story, unfortunately. So we don't know where her story ends. But yeah, it's definitely Paul sort of just navigating the world in front of him and then responding to it. And so, yeah, like he's in this very real moment of sort of being imprisoned. So he has now sort of, maybe not willingly, but at least taken on this identity sort of as an outsider by being a Jewish man outside of sort of his centers of power and traveling other places in the Roman Empire. and now, imprisoned for what he's been doing. And so we see Paul taking on this sort of new identity and maybe even a little bit of a vulnerable situation, which isn't how I think of the Apostle Paul very much at all. I think, last week we had looked at the Jerusalem Council, and I had forgotten to say, like, if you want to see another perspective, look at Paul from Galatians 2. Like, it's a very different perspective. Paul has a very different take on sort of how he views himself. But yeah, Paul's put in this vulnerable sort of almost desperate kind of situation, and then sort of responds faithfully out of that when he has an opportunity to maybe escape when his chains fall off. So yeah, so there's definitely something about sort of this humanity, and Paul's facing some new circumstances too.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important to think too, because right, the whole like thrust of the lesson, right, is like this idea of like dangerous places, strange circumstances, but to also kind of ask this question of like what kind of dangerous, but like what is the danger, like, because I think that sometimes we can kind of center this like certain ideas of like that get very like heroic, or are you going to a place like where you can be like physically imprisoned now and things like that, and there's certainly a place for that. But I think about again, kind of going back to that idea of like, what can we lose socially when we speak up on certain things? What do we lose from like people we have respected if we speak up for certain things on certain trajectories? And this idea of maybe not a physical danger of like being imprisoned, but what about like an emotional or a social kind of danger, particularly for those of us who have a lot of privilege. And I want to be really clear about that, that like, that's not something that I feel like there's as much of a need for people to sit with on a spiritual level if they are living on the margins or don't have a lot of privilege, that they're already doing a lot of that work all the time. But for those of us who have a lot of privilege, that, this idea of like so much of what we aren't even really willing to consider as danger, it's not a threat to our bodies. But maybe to our social status, or maybe to like the sake of convenience or something. Again, thinking about the lectures that I just had the opportunity to hear with Dr. Willie Jennings, and he talked about how discipleship happens at the zoning board meetings. It's like people will let you talk about Jesus all day, but until you start showing up at the zoning board meetings, until you start saying, hey, how are we structuring the cities, and who's being displaced from where, and what is happening in our community if we do this thing that's bringing progress, who is losing in that situation. Once you start talking about that, people will be like, hold on, hold on here. And so I think about that too, of like kind of going back again to that question of like, it's fine, nobody had a big deal with Paul being there until he took away that person's ability to make money off of this enslaved girl.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, he's definitely disrupting these sort of social norms with sort of what he's doing, like not just here, but like as he continues to move forward too. Like, there's a lot of this disruption of social norms, and that one sort of being one of the big ones here in our chapter. And then also like, he it seems like he's made himself at least a little bit vulnerable in that he has to rely on the hospitality of these people who have been converted. So even Paul, this sort of like, arrogant type of person, as he comes across in places like Galatians 2, like he has to face a little bit of humility, maybe, at least as Acts tells the story. And so he has to rely on the hospitality of Lydia and the jailer. And so he's walking into this unfamiliar space to him that he can't necessarily control anymore. And so I think there is something about like, what does it mean to be faithful to the Spirit, and what might it cost us? I think that's a good question that comes out of here.
Yeah. And the question of like, when do we need to be the recipients of hospitality too? I think that often in the Christian circles that I grew up in, but even the Christian circles that I'm a part of today, we tend to be really centered around the idea of offering hospitality, which is also like one of my favorite things to do. Like, I love to be like, hosting things or cooking people food or whatever. Like I just, there's nothing I love more in life than showing up at your door with casserole. I love to do that. And that's not Paul's position here, right? And so how do we even start to ask the questions of where are we being invited to depend on hospitality? to be, to be dependent on others, and to be dependent on others who aren't necessarily like part of our community in the way that we would traditionally define that.
Yeah. And the fact that the people that seem drawn to this new message movement, whatever that Paul is talking about, are people who are willing to put themselves out there. And so like, it seems to attract a certain kind of person as well. And I think that's something else that we could look at as you prepare for the lesson this week, of like, what is appealing about Paul's message? Like, we don't actually hear a lot of the words that Paul's actually preaching here, but we see the responses to these people and sort of the way that they, like, what would the profile of someone who is drawn to Paul's message, who converts here, like both Lydia's household and the jailer's household, like they both are baptized. And so they've joined this movement. Like, what is the profile? What does it look like, somebody who would be willing to join this movement? I think that's another way that you could look at things in this lesson.
Absolutely. And like, in the absence of having a lot of the words that he's saying, you teach too, right? This idea of like the method is the message. Like how is Paul conducting himself too? In a way that this, regardless of what he is or isn't saying, like, how is he like carrying himself? What is it about how he's just navigating these situations that's causing such a range of people to respond in this way, and to convert and to be baptized and things like that. And to maybe give that consideration too, that sometimes it's not just what statements are we making or what are we preaching or what are we saying. Those things matter for sure. But also like, how are we being with one another? And how are we just being in the world? And is that something that speaks to this idea of inclusion and liberation? Does it feel like freedom when people are around you? And if it doesn't, then it doesn't matter how much you're talking about like inclusion and freedom and things like that. If you feel oppressive to be around, then that's how people are going to experience you and whatever it is you're saying.
Yeah. And again, I think that's been a message that we've seen throughout. Like we talked in Acts chapter 8 with the Ethiopian eunuch, like that begins with sort of this justice denied. And then, as we keep moving through, we see all of these different places where the good news is about sort of liberation for people being set free from things. It's not about added burdens being put on or sort of restrictions being put onto this good news message. It's about liberation and freedom. So, yeah.
Well, I think that kind of covers what I was thinking about here. Do you have any more thoughts on this passage before we?
No, I think that's pretty well what I had. So I guess we'll end here. And Megan, it's been wonderful to have these conversations with you this month here. And hopefully for those of you participating in preparing for your lessons or your sessions each week, that you've gotten something out of these conversations. We are going to be signing off here. The month of July is over, and so you'll have a new set of conversation partners coming in August, but it's been a delight to have these conversations, to be able to share this with you. And we trust that the work that we've done here this week will lead to some fruitful discussions for you in your lessons this week.